Alright, welcome to part 4 of Balance of World Order. So, revisiting the second shift, rethinking value in outsourcing of social reproduction. So, I'm skipping the abstract just to get cut to the chase here. So, these articles that I'm reading, by the way, are the concepts from the book, if you haven't already been watching. Um, so, I assume not. The view count's very low, but I do make these videos for me, and it's fun. And I try to be safe, just in case that I do get noticed. I don't want any like strange shit to be like befalling anyone through my rhetoric. Anyways, introduction. Social reproduction analysis has examined the structurally centered role of unpaid social reproduction for capital accumulation and linked it to the particular form of oppression that women face as performers of unpaid domestic labor under capitalism, e.g., Dalla Costa and James, Epstein, Federici, Hartman. Efforts to recognize this type of unpaid labor as valuable or manifold. Some scholars have examined the ways in which unpaid social reproduction subsidizes capital accumulation, while others have created measures to grasp the value entailed in this labor as part of the nation state's GDP, or with a respect to gender equality indices and extended earnings measures. Moreover, economists have created ways to estimate the value of time spent on unpaid domestic work. Qualitative research on social reproduction has not engendered a similar effort at situating the social relations that shape outsourced social reproductive work within the relations of production, even though it is generally agreed that social reproduction also involves paid work. The growing phenomena of outsourcing social reproduction in the global north is explained as a response to women's increasing participation in the labor market combined with a gender division of domestic work and a reprivatization of social reproduction due to state disinvestment in neoliberal austerity policies. Studies have emphasized how outsourcing is valuable for the people who outsource social reproduction, which pertains to an elevated class status or to an accumulation of emotional surplus value that is distributed along the global care chains. The existing qualitative research does not consider the relation of paid reproductive work to productive work, and consequently, it overlooks the increasing demand of capital on labor that configures the need for outsourcing reproductive labor, drawing on in depth empirical research with employers of migrant care and domestic workers. This article contributes to the existing literature on outsourcing social reproduction through an analysis of the various values that the employers of domestic workers attach to outsourcing, which are often linked to time and more specifically labor time. In this article, we focus on employers of care and domestic workers as workers who themselves labor to produce surplus value in their own paid employment. We argue that outsourcing social reproduction often takes the form of purchasing expensive time enabled by hiring migrant domestic workers, which those who outsource convert into productive labor time, thereby subsidizing their own labor to increment economic value for their own employers. In other words, to facilitate the accumulation of capital, employers of domestic workers meet increasing demands to engage in reproductive labor time, which they are themselves value more highly than unpaid domestic labor. We attend to the connections between the spheres of production and reproduction by developing an integrated link between migrant workers' labor power and employers' labor power. The analysis demonstrates that the employers of migrant care and domestic workers often work a second shift of paid employment in the evening, enabled by the outsourcing of social reproductive work. Hence, the employers of domestic workers invest in their own human capital in an effort to construct themselves as more valuable workers for their employers by working more and more, by restoring themselves as workers more efficiently. While much research examines the work and labor conditions of migrant care and domestic workers, studies have consistently overlooked the increasing pressures faced by the employees of domestic workers as they navigate their own paid employment. This gap persists despite a burgeoning body of empirical evidence on the strain that workers experience in the capitalist economies of the global north. In Finland, as in other Nordic countries, the employers of care and domestic workers are unequivocally workers themselves. Understanding the employers of domestic workers as workers themselves in capitalistic relations of production enables us to conceptualize them as integrated part of the working upper middle class and middle class. Employers of domestic workers are indisputably part of the privileged class of workers. They are nevertheless workers who struggle within time to meet the demands of increased reproductive labor time. This perspective limits us to move beyond uh, depictions of outsourcing as reproduction, the upper class, and provide a more nuanced analysis of the class relationship constructed through social production or reproduction. In what follows, we first discuss research on value in outsourcing social reproduction, while which we address the Finnish context of our study. We then present our methodology and findings on employers and domestic workers' evaluation of time, followed by our conclusions. Tracing the value in outsourcing social reproduction. The related but often distinct strands of literature on social reproduction in migrant care and domestic work have theorized in different ways about social reproductive labor and its outsourcing. They generally agree that performing both unpaid and paid domestic labor is devalued for workers and remains societally unrecognized, while it simultaneously subsidizes capital accumulation and is valuable for the employees of domestic workers. The literature on migrant care and domestic workers emphasizes the precarity of working conditions and the racialized and gendered exploitation of migrant workers. Research on social reproduction, on the other hand, has discussed depletion through social reproduction, which is often borne by women, and how the process of externalizing the cost of reproducing labor via reproducing labor power via commodification and the marketization may devalue the labor for workers. Moreover, migrant care and migrant care and domestic work research argues that outsourcing social reproduction in the global north is a response to women's increasing participation in formal employment combined with a gendered division of domestic work. Adding to this proposition, social reproduction research highlights how the concurrent neoliberal austerity politics and disinvestment from social welfare transfers responsibility for reproductive labor to private families, causing a crisis of social reproduction. Based on these perspectives, capital resides mainly in relation to the state, which is scaling back public expenditure on welfare, while ignoring the ways in which the increasing demands of capital in relation to labor gives rise to the need to outsource social reproduction. As we will discuss in the following section, the crisis of social reproduction does not fully account for the Finnish case, in which there is a growing demand to outsource reproductive work despite the existence of an extensive public child care system. What drives the demand in this case is a perceived scarcity of time and mounting pressures on individuals to engage in productive labor time at their paid employment. Similarly, while research has explored the ways in which outsourcing is valuable for the employers of care and domestic workers, the findings are rarely connected to careful consideration of the value production that outsourcing may enable employers to engage in. Both strands of literature instead discuss how private employment reproduces and enhances social class and modern domesticity. In addition, studies on migrant care and domestic work have highlighted the types of domestic affective value that employers gain by freeing themselves of the need to engage in domestic work, as well as the moral values and value tensions present in outsourcing. So, yeah, we kind of thought it was like a break from it all when we actually lose out on something meaningful, just by doing it ourselves for the most part. And really, nobody wants to do the dirty work, especially when our schedules are like really tight and nobody has time to really do anything. So, it really is an issue of your time and the worker labor time, and not just you time as in chilling on the couch, like you time to clean the house and do something like productive, not just working. So, all right, where was I? According to the global care chain concept, the employing family yields emotional surplus value that is distributed along the care chains. Scholars have analyzed the possible valorization of care and emphasized the difficulty of assigning orthodox notions of value to care. Both strands of literature and place emphasis on the gender division of reproductive labor, which affects the efforts of employers of domestic workers to balance work and family life. Time use itself is gendered, with men having more control over their time and greater access to free time, especially in the Nordic countries, where the heterosexual dual-earner couples are expected to share household tasks equally. Outsourcing allows couples to achieve a certain level of gender equality without having men to take on more reproductive tasks. In comparison, professional middle-class women tend to perform unpaid reproductive labor as a second shift at home after completing their first shift in paid employment. Women in the global north perform the majority of unpaid domestic work, despite usually being engaged in paid employment as well. Moreover, the dominating discourse on intensive motherhood intersects with class to affect women's time use differently to that of men. These perspectives suggest that private employment is particularly beneficial to the male employer. Some scholars also mention employers' work management needs. Hold on. It's fucking hot out here, guys. Alright. Work management needs. And their demanding jobs. Moreover, studies have mentioned that employers gain flexible time through outsourcing, but they rarely specify why flexible time is needed or investigate the value of such time. Our article fills the gap by analyzing how outsourcing social reproduction is linked to, organizes, and enhances the value of time. So notice, men initially have the privilege, and women were given the privilege to work, but they also are forced into the position to also do house cleaning and such like that, while men kind of are privileged to just opt out of that or hire a nanny or something like that, while mostly women are single, I believe, in poverty and such, which is a neoliberal restructuring, I believe, when all they wanted was the financial ability to work at home, take care of children, and clean the house. Men, I'm sure some men help with this, but this actually is an issue of privilege and what is expected from women. So, in addition, we contribute to the existing literature by examining how class and gender division of labor intersect with the increasing demands that capital places on work. Currently, neither of the existing strands of literature on outsourcing reproductive labor gives central focus on the employers of domestic workers as workers themselves, nor do they attempt to truly analyze the mounting pressures faced by the employers of domestic workers as they navigate their own paid employments. This means that present research puts the labor market in a secondary position and frames it as an inevitable context rather than objective analysis. By failing to extend an analysis of outsourcing reproductive labor to include changes in the current mode of production, such studies often offer little insight on the actual labor relations impacting those who employ domestic workers, thus running the risk of overlooking the ways in which social relations are embedded with economic and material structures. For Marx, labor necessarily stands in relation to time. The commodification of labor power both produces and requires socially necessary labor time, which is linked to the production of value. It is therefore meaningful to analyze the valuation of time in relation to the outsourcing of social reproduction. This makes it possible to trace the value reproduction through outsourcing social reproduction, which extends beyond the employer's personal benefit to include the ways in which outsourcing is organized to enhance the amount of productive social labor time and ultimately the accumulation of capital. So all this work is being done, wages are being sort of stripped as there's more outsourced labor so we can pay them less, and when there's migrants under the table, I believe wages might get crushed in that case. So they really don't care about the workers. They just want the work done. Alright. Don't get me wrong, this is not a hate on immigrants or anything like that. Obviously, I would like to think that people watching my content don't get that impression of me. Anyways, the Finnish context, accentuating the explanation of work. Historically, the egalitarian ethos of the Nordic welfare states have replaced some of the reproductive labor formerly done by the individual woman and families with collective actors, with states developing affordable public childcare services. The Nordic welfare state model encouraged women's participation in the labor market by creating public services and welfare that have allowed them to combine wage labor and family life without having to pay for private care. Since the 1990s, however, the state has increasingly promoted individual responsibility and privatization of social reproductive tasks via various cash for care programs and tax credits. Nevertheless, Finland has an extensive and affordable public child care system due to municipal subventions based on income, number of children, and family size. Municipal child care centers continue to be the main providers of child care. In 1985, approximately 55% of children who took part in early child care pedagogy participated in public child care, whereas in 2020 the percentage has increased to 77%. While parents in general are content with the quality of care services, the Finnish care regime suffers from a severe lack of labor, which affects the quality of public child care. Yes, the welfare to pension ratio is definitely like a scheme. If you read The Birth Earth, basically is just a pyramid scheme or a type of like a plan that really hopes that the citizenry sort of votes on their feet and has a child to keep the financial system running. So that's pretty basic explanation of something pretty complex, but yeah. Recent research has emphasized how neoliberal austerity policies and state disinvestment from the public service provision has increasingly transferred responsibility for reproductive labor to families, particularly in North America. Besançon and Luxton and Fraser. Outsourcing then occurs as a response to neoliberalization. Sorry, there's been a lot of like military plane activity today. Alright. Outsourcing then occurs as a response to the neoliberalization of state policies. Simultaneously, it is often assumed the greater investment in public child care would reduce the private employment of care and domestic workers. Comparatively, in the Finnish context, there is a growing demand to outsource social reproduction among upper middle class professionals, despite the availability of public child care services. Such individuals exhibit a demand for the increasing availability in child care and social reproduction that points towards the emergence of the class time discipline. Currently, the tax credit that subsidizes care and domestic work increases the price and social reproductive work, which creates added incentives to employ care and domestic workers. Recent research and also suggests that the growing demand for outsourcing is explained by women's increasing participation in the labor market, which allows for some variations. Generally in Finland, women, and especially working class women, have participated in the labor market for a long time, and a dual career family is particularly a strong norm. In the 1950s, half of all married women were employed, and the most recent data from 2018 reveals that 92% of fathers and 72% of mothers participated in the labor force at that time. Therefore, and often evoked assumptions of a care deficit due to women's participation in the formal employment does not adequately explain the Finnish situation. Nevertheless, gender does offer a partial explanation for outsourcing. According to the most recent OECD data, Finnish women spend 235.8 minutes per day doing unpaid labor, while the equivalent time for men is 157.5 minutes per day. In Finnish, women are expected to pursue full-time careers while simultaneously continuing to bear a greater responsibility for unpaid domestic reproductive labor. In addition, women account for the majority of parental allowances. In 2019, women accounted for 97% of this allowance, while only 25% of men took 1 month paternity leave. The effort needed to arrange a work-life balance thus affects women and men differently, as time spent on unpaid reproductive labor is valued differently according to gender. I find this fascinating. This is so true. Women are overall expected to do household duties, and men are overall just expected to be at work no matter what. So, I think the burden is also on women of color specifically, because all the tasks sort of go downward to the lower class, because nobody really wants to do any of the dirty work. So the poor people of color, they get handed down the thankless jobs, so to speak. Now, I would say it could be potentially rewarding to clean your home and come to something like that, but that's not how it is. Not in our schedules. Alright. In addition, the changing labor market and the increasing pressures faced by workers create the demand to outsource social reproduction, as the Fortis regime and standing working hours are downscaled. Empirical studies on working life in Europe demonstrate that workers are currently experiencing increasing levels of work intensity, which occurs for workers both in managerial as well as low-paid positions. Work is characterized as fragmented, intensified, and moving beyond temporal and spatial borders. A key finding of research on managerial work is that official work hours are not becoming longer, rather time pressure at work is increasing, which leads to increasing amount of time spent working. So I thought it was normal for my boss just to have us sweep the hallway, sweep outside, pick up trash off the ground in the parking lot, clean the stovetops. But then my boss wanted me to pick the weeds, and I thought that was truly bizarre. Hit me up in the comments if you think that's going a little too far. Like, as a dishwasher too, like, that's That's just look busy like no matter what you do. That's just insane. Okay. According to the recent findings, these changes are especially evident in the Nordic countries, particularly among those in the higher socioeconomic groups. Although flexibility and the lack of temporal boundaries allow for more control over work hours, time pressure often leads to increasing time spent working. In Finland, it is common for both men and women with children to work overtime in the evenings or at weekends. On average, employers spent 39 hours per week engaging in paid employment, with directors working on average of 45 hours per week. However, this work is not confined to social work hours. 23% of Finnish workers report being contacted about work-related matters during their free time that requires immediate action, while 13% report being contacted about less urgent matters. Moreover, Finnish Workers' Time Act, which sets workers' hours at a maximum at 40 hours per week, does not apply to work in expert positions comparable to performing managerial tasks. Subsequently, managerial expert positions are not subject to the Working Time Act. So, when I first started working at my job, you had to plan in advance when you wanted to change the schedule. But I can just be told to come in on my day off with no advance at all. And honestly, people can plan a vacation and be gone for weeks or whatever, but you can't really call out sick if there's no one to cover you. And that's fine, that's hit or miss. Take that or leave it what you will, but that's really fucked up. Alright. Methodology. The empirical data includes in-depth thematic interviews with private Finnish employers of the migrant nannies and/or domestic workers. The interviewers were conducted in 2016 and in 2013 to 2021. The interviewed employers of migrant nannies slash AU pairs domestic workers were between 31 and 63 years of age and included 26 women and 5 men, all except one native-born Finns. All except one were native-born Finns, sorry. The participants had 1 to 4 children. 7 had hired a full-time nanny and/or domestic worker. 17% had hired 1 part-time, and 7 had hired AU pairs. Some had hired both AU pairs and migrant domestic workers. 10 participants had hired live-in AU pairs of nannies and domestic workers. The decision to hire was made jointly. Many of the participants and children attended public child care part-time were partly cared for by nanny or an AU pair. It was thus common to combine private and public child care. Most participants were married in heterosexual relationships. 2 women and 1 man were divorced. While the man shared custody over the children, the divorced women were single parents. Most participants and their partners had advanced university degrees, and all participants and their partners were working. Both women and men mostly worked as specialists or professionals in organizations or companies or in executive positions. 5 worked as self-employed consultants. 1 participant owned a small-scale company with 6 employees, and the participant worker worked on the same work tasks on the employees. Hence, we also include this participant within the category of the worker, upper middle class. The interviews lasted for an average of 1 hour and were conducted in Swedish and Finnish. Experts were translated into English by the authors. Participants were found through snowball sampling, personal contacts, and social media and various organizations. The interviewers were conducted in locations that were convenient for the participants, such as cafes or participants' homes or workplaces. Participants were told that the content and aims of the research beforehand and signed a consent form. They were told that they could withdraw from the research project at any point. All names used in articles are pseudonyms. In the interviews, we ask questions about the participants' work, their decisions to hire privately, their employer's work conditions, and the relationships with their employee. The analysis involved first coding and interviews using Atlas TI based on a continually developed coding frame, and then applying content analysis to the coding sections. Since the article is central on demand, the analysis focused on sections in the data regarding the employer's decisions to hire a private migrant nanny/domestic worker. While the participants articulated various reasons that they had led them to the decision to hire privately and numerous desires and needs they were hoping to satisfy by having done so. The main aims resolved around combining work with their own social reproductive tasks. The analysis addresses the meanings of paid care and domestic work for the participants, especially within respect to how they construct them as valuable and linked to value. Hence, the analysis is linked to theorizing on the value engendered through social reproduction. Alright, getting more water. Alright, the value of reproduction. This section discusses the interconnectedness of value, time, and labor in outsourcing social reproduction. We find that time is constructed at a purchased commodity, constructed as a purchased commodity. Sorry, there's cracks on my screen. That is organized to enhance value in diverse ways, either as reproductive labor or as reproductive labor value in its ability to decelerate the pace of everyday life. The employers we interviewed articulated a variety of culturally accepted motives for employing nannies, AU pairs, and domestic workers. As we discuss in this section, the main reasons behind depletion through social reproduction in the data was time scarcity, or the participants' reported lack of time for taking care of their own reproductive needs. Participants connected this key problem to their own paid employments, which they described as burdensome, overly taxing, and unpredictable. True. The research participants reiterated the idea of time as a scarce resource. Time is what they most urgently lacked, and they sought to free up more time through outsourcing social reproduction. Since the employers of domestic workers faced increasing pressure and the lack of flexibility at work, they chose to hire a nanny and domestic workers to produce greater flexibility for themselves. Statements such as the below comment by Evelina are abundant in the data. The pace is very hectic. There are a lot of changes and a lot of interruptions. It is quite burdensome. And if I travel, it affects the pace. It's another thing if the workday or the working week should be very predictable. Then I would not have to opt for these decisions. Hiring an AU pair, that is. Evelina, who worked for an IT company at the time of the interview, constructed the unpredictability and hectic pace of work as the main reason why she and her husband decided to hire an AU pair to care for their young children. Adelina, who worked as a specialist in the company, described her work as often quite hectic and fluid, and requiring a lot of cognitive resources and temporal resources. In the analysis, we generated time and temporality as central themes from the interview data. The participants constructed the relationship between time and labor and demonstrated how their paid employment affects the organization of time. Work, according to the participants, requires to an increasing extent temporal resources, work, and consumes time. It flows from the time/space boundary, and work accelerates the pace of time, making it hectic and fluid. While such changes in a newly emerging temporal work culture have previously been documented in the UK and US context, our findings suggest that such developments are occurring also in Finland, in the Nordic welfare, sorry, flubbing my words here, welfare state context. God, it feels like 100 degrees, by the way. At least that's what the weather said. Anyways, this points to the relevance of the analysis outsourcing in relation to the paid employments. Employers of domestic workers are workers with struggle within time as they face increasing pressure to engage in reproductive labor time. Another employer of domestic worker, Andre, described his attempts at navigating the pressures set by his paid employment as follows: quote, "Time is not enough, and I am not enough, and I am not enough." Wow, that's pretty dark. To appease this experienced time scarcity, employers of domestic workers outsource social reproduction to buy time with money. Matthias, an employer of full-time nanny and domestic worker, received a growing requirement at work as one of the main reasons behind his decision to hire a nanny and domestic worker. One reason, of course, is that the requirement increased all the time. If I would survive nicely with my work doing this, I would be happy to make food at home and so forth, but the screw is tightened at work and everywhere else. So one has one has to buy time with money to time to spend with the children at work. Feeling stressed by this experienced state of inadequacy, both time and one's own resources appear insufficient for meeting everyday productive and reproductive demands. Employers of domestic workers exhibit a devaluation of their paid work by outsourcing reproductive tasks. Instead of questioning the continuous burden of their paid employment and attempting to reorganize it, they choose to hire domestic workers to provide them with flexible labor hours. This decision is constructed in accordance with the value structure of contemporary society. Devalued social reproduction is outsourced, and as paid workers will suddenly yield higher value in the future. In exchange for the salary, the labor of domestic workers produces the commodity time desired by employers. This immaterial time commodity is never separated from value, since employers utilize it to increment value either, as we demonstrate, for their own paid employment or else for their own self-reproduction as workers. The logic of capital appears in the construction of time as valuable, as something linked to value. However, for the research participants, it is far from easy to question and criticize the working conditions. Even opting for part-time work can prove challenging. One female participant remarked that working part-time in her line of work would be a joke, since her work cannot be cut short. She would end up doing the same amount of work in a shorter amount of time for less pay. So this is actually what happened recently. So the building wasn't opened except for the weekend because of some holiday nonsense. And so work was hectic, and the paycheck, I kind of expected to get less, but somehow we didn't. I don't know what's going on there, but it's just you expected to get paid less. And it's not like the boss, you don't want to communicate like, "Hey boss, did you give me more for some reason?" Like, you're not going to do that. That's stupid. Okay. The second shift revisited. Purchasing affordable time to produce economic value. Employers of domestic workers circumvent the strain they would otherwise face in performing a second shift of unpaid reproductive labor by outsourcing parts of it to migrant workers. Nevertheless, several respondents mentioned that they instead worked regularly a second shift or paid employment at home in the evenings after putting their children to sleep. The time that participants purchased through outsourcing and paid for out of pocket was then utilized to increase their own reproductive labor time. This points to a connection between migrant domestic workers' labor power and both the labor power and labor time of employments of domestic workers. In effect, the employers of domestic workers subsidize their own labor time to increment economic value for their own employers. Respondents describe the practice of dividing up their workday so that the work that requires more cognitive capacity is done during the daytime in the office, while emails are answered in the evenings while they are tired. Most interviewees' work was not tied to clearly defined working hours, but was rather project-based work. Their work was then structured around deadlines. Evelina described her working day as being divided into two parts. Quote, "It is normal that first we do a complete working day at work, and then we are at home for a while and strive to be present during the two, maybe 3 hours that the child is awake, and then we continue our adjacent working day. This resembles how Linda, an employer of a full-time nanny and domestic worker, described her working day. At 19:30, I put the children to bed, and 20 to 23 are usually my most efficient working hours. That is when I answer all my emails and go through everything. The mobile phone is so good because you can do it in the bathroom, where the children is sleeping, or bedroom, where the children is sleeping, there is next to me, and I am actively working." Yeah, I mean, that does sound pretty efficient. You're watching the children and, pretty much doing your paperwork, essentially. I mean, the people who own the home and own the children, it's unfortunate they're not the ones in charge doing this, but, I mean, this is not a case against migrants and immigration. It's unfortunate how we're sort of given the table scraps and barely enough time to function. Alright. Several participants described their jobs as having no time cards and no exact working hours, saying that the Finnish Working Time Act, see also page 5 in this article, does not apply to their work. They constructed their work as involving, quote, responsibility and freedom, and emphasized that they also enjoy the flexibility of taking a day off or running errands in the middle of the day. However, the findings show that most respondents rather used the time liberated from performing unpaid domestic work to do more paid work. The second shift, or paid work in the evenings, is more possible by hiring a nanny or a domestic worker, since that time would otherwise be dedicated to doing care work, cooking, cleaning, or doing the laundry and dishes at home. Participants also rationalized the availability of this purchased time and equated it with the possibility to produce economic value at work. Oscar, an employer of a part-time domestic worker, calculated that it was more profitable for him to spend time working rather than using the same amount of time on unpaid reproductive work at home. It is quite a lot to do, a lot of time spent. Economically, it is more profitable for me to work than to do domestic work. I earn more than 15 euros an hour, so it is an alternative. The more I work, the more I, at least in theory, gain. Perhaps not literally, but at least I do the stuff I need to do. So, it's sad that he's talking about work somewhere else and not the work at home. This is sort of privileged talk in a way, but we cannot be to blame for this. We are forced into these positions. So, Jenna, an employer of part-time nanny and a domestic worker, made a similar calculation. If you think that I can if you think that I now pay the worker around €350 per month plus employer expenses, so roughly about €500 a month. I earn a lot more by being at work myself. I'll still profit by working. This rhetoric revalues the monetary value of the employer's labor time while it simultaneously devalues migrant workers' labor time. It also constructs a link between outsourcing social reproduction and reproductive labor time. Some participants analogously devalued reproductive tasks in relation to their revalued free time. Anna, a consultant who hired a part-time domestic worker, described her free time as too precious and valuable to be used on domestic work, contrasting it to the inexpensive hourly rate of a domestic worker. In domestic statements, participants associate a value with time and labor's time. With time and labor time. The respondents' construction of free time as a precious resource related to the increase in time of labor time that organizes their daily lives. Some of the interviewees who owned their own businesses reported hiring a domestic worker to work both in their offices and in their homes. In such cases, the company paid the domestic worker's salary. For tax reasons, it is more profitable than the company pays in salary of the domestic worker since it can be deducted from the company taxes as other wages. In such instances, a domestic or care worker hired by the company is equal to an in-kind benefit, similar to a company car. In general, and self-employed employees hired a nanny and domestic workers for long periods of time than the participants who were employees. In such cases, outsourcing social reproduction is more directly connected to the reproduction of surplus value for the self-employed participants. However, the self-employed employers of domestic workers also face the requirements of increased reproductive labor time. Many described having no work hours and working irregular hours and long days to secure the continuation of their livelihood. Respondents then perceive the labor time of a third person as a factor that subsidizes the continuous effort and competition within and over time. In addition, we identified the cost of hiring a domestic worker as essential in the data. Employers of domestic workers often calculated the time they saved and money they spent in relation to the space of such services. Several participants acknowledged that one of the many main reasons for the hiring of migrant workers instead of native Finnish workers was the price of their labor. Native Finnish workers are able to demand a higher wage for their labor and often specialize in certain tasks. For example, Finnish nannies seldom clean the house. In comparison, migrant workers on contemporary residence permits are more flexible in terms of time spent at work and more tasks. Moreover, migrant domestic workers from outside the EU receive residence permits that are tied to a specific employment sector, which may function as a source of bargaining power for employers of domestic workers. As previous research has shown, care and domestic work is structured along the axis of racialization, migrant status, and gender. The economic value and the employers of domestic workers derive from purchasing affordable time via employing care and domestic workers not only points to the links between production and reproduction, but also demonstrates that outsourcing social reproduction is a site for class formation, and that is configured by local political and economic legal context. Alright. So, I think I'm going to make this a part 2. I will be back in the next one, guys.